Hello there and welcome back to my channel. For those who are the first time here, my name is Zach. I'm a 22 years old Russian who left Russia because of the war against Ukraine. And today, since in September, education starts in Russia for all the levels of education, to schools, universities, colleges, we're gonna make a review on a brand new Russian history book featuring 20th and 21st century. So basically the history of the USSR and the history of modern Russia. And yeah, there used to be a lot of conspiracy theories about history of those periods. So today, Russian government decided to tell you what actually happened. But before I continue, let me tell you about a new YouTuber out there who speaks English, and he both from Ukraine and from Russia. He makes videos about both of those countries, and he gives his perspective as a person from both cultures on this war. Here is a small piece from his video.
While that's understandable that many Ukrainians now hate Russia, its people and its government, I find myself unable and unwilling to fully embrace that sentiment, because I simply don't feel that way towards Russia. I grew up in a beautiful city called Odessa. As a little boy, of course, I didn't even think about such concepts as nations, countries and stuff. I just absorbed everything around me. Russian and Ukrainian cultures have both taken a huge part in the life of my native city and my personal life. I moved to Russia and then back to Ukraine multiple times. These experiences have given me a rich understanding of my being. I have made a lot of friends in both Russia and Ukraine. These two countries became really close to me. Within each, I encountered polite and helpful people.
The link to Danny's channel is going to be in the description below, but we are continuing to speak about the new Russian history book. But before we get into it, let me tell you about my school experience and how, in my opinion, I was brainwashed by the Russian government to be more patriotic of modern Russia, to feel better about the USSR ancestry, and just to be a better citizen of the country. So I finished my high school back in 2019, so it's been about 4 years now, but I still remember it as it was yesterday. So I'm gonna tell you about what happened throughout my high school and middle school. I don't remember much of like elementary school life, and tell you how government kind of interfered in my view on the world. The first event which comes to my mind right away, I remember it was back in 2014. I think I was about 13 years old at that moment, so it was like 6th grade, or I think it was 7th grade, yeah, actually. At that time, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. While Ukraine had its revolution, Russia were like, okay, we're gonna take it back. So that's what eventually happened. And I remember that all over Russia, people were fiercely, celebrating that event. And of course, the government wanted that young people would also celebrate it and get this mentality that it is a celebration, it is a victory of Russia and not a violation of international law and country's independence. I remember we even had one class, I think it was literature class, so Russian literature class. It was replaced by the class related to annexation of Crimea. And of course I'm saying annexation because I mean this. But of course, it was not called annexation back then. It was called like Crimea is going back to the motherland. And eventually, they would just basically teach us propaganda at that class, how Crimea always used to be Russian, and it was a mistake that Crimea became Ukrainian, and it's all fair what Russia does to Ukraine, annexing its territories. They would teach us about it for about like an hour, or I think it was even 2 classes straight. So it was just some kind of propaganda that Kremlin prepared for middle schools, and it would send them over there. I was actually about 13 at that time. So yeah, I think at that age, you kind of believe almost everything you see on the news. You don't really have the critical mentality of that. And of course, I believe that. I have a story about how I was brainwashed in school, so you can check it out for more deeper information. Also remember that in the middle school, we were made to sing songs holding like wooden AKs to celebrate veterans of Afghan war, and I think it was also Chechen war. So we would sing some military songs to them. We would wear military uniform in the school, and so veterans would come to the school and listen how we celebrate them, basically. Also, the life safety classes, which usually Russian school kids have from 5th grade up to graduation, basically up to 11th grade, they would tell us about how to assemble AKs already at the 8th grade. So I think it's like 14 or 15 years old. And I remember me and my classmates, it doesn't matter who are boys or girls, everyone were assembling and disassembling AKs. And we were doing this on time, and there is even a competition in Russia for doing that. And basically, it's a mandatory subject. You cannot not take it, basically. You cannot not disassemble or assemble an AK. It means you drop out from school, basically. In history books, they would really briefly describe the history of modern Russia and the late USSR. And I think it's actually a right thing to do because, history is really like subjective subject. It's a really subjective science, even if we can call this a science. And I think we can only somehow objectively look at the history way back if only some time passes and another views on those events appear, and people who project those views, opinions, will not be afraid of being oppressed for their views. So, for knowing the real history, some time should pass. And that's why I think it would be good to keep it as it was in history books of Russian history when I was in school, when there were a couple of chapters about modern Russian history. And yeah, it was kind of like propaganda in a way, because I remember they would have like a chapter about annexation of Crimea, but it would only take like a couple of pages. And yeah, they would just say what Kremlin basically always say about it, what Putin say about Crimea in 2014. But usually it was not that much of a propaganda. So I remember my classmates would just keep that. And teachers would not even ask you about that information on any tests, on any subjects. I remember also when I was passing my Russian SAT, it's called YEGA, Unified State Exam. Over there you pick subjects you want to pass. So I picked the social science because I wanted to become a lawyer, and you need to pick that to become a lawyer. And so one of the final tasks in that in that exam was you needed to read the text of an author and to state if you are agree with the statement or not, and explain why. So it's like an essay, basically. And imagine I had an author who was Putin. Jeez, I remember I was sitting in the classroom, like where we had this exam. I was like laughing out loud almost when I saw and Putin being an author of a text. And text was about the pension reform. So basically they raised up the age of for retirement. So I got this whole text and I needed to read it, and I needed either to agree with the text or disagree with the text. And I think you understand what's going to be like the outcome, what's going to be your grade if you disagree with a supreme leader Putin. It was back in 2019. Still kind of oppressive times in a way. And of course, I just had no choice but to agree and to prove Putin's points. And guess what? I got the highest ever grade for that task, because I could later see my results, and I had the highest results. And I remember one other my friend, he was trying to kind of debate with Putin in his essay, and he got almost 10%. So it just speaks for yourself. So still, there was some kind of propaganda, but not as much as nowadays. So that's why I'm going to tell you today about how they have written a new history book about modern Russian history and the late USSR. And you're going to be surprised on how much propaganda was written in this textbook, and how much of this was written not for just high schoolers or middle schoolers. No, it was written for only one reader, who is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. About 75 pages of the entire book, which consists out of 390 pages. So 75 pages are about Putin's rule, about how Putin is great, and who can become the most unbiased person to write a history book about Putin's rule rather than the assistant of the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Medinsky. an advertiser of financial pyramids in the 90s, the holder of a doctorate in history, which the scientific community has repeatedly tried to deprive him of for mass errors and being unscientific and ideologized, Minister of Culture in the past, from 2018 to 2020, who was prematurely removed from his office by his own party due to big numbers of scandals, and one of the Putin's most passionate supporters, known for saying Putin is the absolute genius of modern real politics. You heard it right. The history book about Putin is written by an assistant of Putin. The head of the Moscow State Institute of International Relationships, Anatoly Tarkunov, is also mentioned as a co-author of the textbook, but many believe that he was actually added simply to add credibility to the book, and that in fact he did not participate in writing of the textbook in any way. Looking at the choice of author, we can clearly say that this book was written for only one and the most important reader, Vladimir Putin. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and firstly look at the book itself. And of course, we will start with the most important chapter in this textbook about the special military operation in Ukraine, which is a war, by the way. Here is how the chapter on the special military operation looks like. The United States are determined to fight to the last Ukrainian. As the Americans say, nothing personal, it's just business. Learning on the internet any information about what's going on in Ukraine now, remember, the global industry for the production of staged commercials, fake photos, and videos work as continuous conveyor. Western social medias and mass medias dominating the global informational space, enthusiastically replicating any informational fakes. Therefore, be careful. Think, why and whose interests and for what are these or those oppositionists, opinion leaders, popular bloggers, and others working out the news? Think, and then you will not become victims of cheap manipulations. This is actually such a common narrative in Russian propaganda. Russian TV has been trying to portray politics as like an abstract term, the most complicated thing in the world. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter how much you do your research, how much you follow politics, how many different resources and perspectives you hear, you will never understand what's really going on. And they've been trying to promote this idea for like decades since Putin came to power. So that's why today we got 60% of Russian who do not care about politics. Those are the people who treat politics as the weather. I told it many times. And this is the result of Putin's like propaganda, of Putin's policy, how to brainwash people. Just get them out here so they do not care whatever we do. Whether we start wars against Ukraine, whether we get some laws that help oligarchs get richer and average Russians get poorer, we don't care. That's what people tend to think because of that propaganda. And of course, they want you to believe that everything that comes out from Ukraine, from the Russian-Ukrainian war, they would say, okay, that's just Photoshop. Even like my relatives, when I called my relatives at the start of the war, or when I would send them like videos, footage from destroyed Ukrainian houses, like dead Russian soldiers, they were like, oh, this is just fake. It's like CIA, USA, they are like, you know, they have thousands of people, Photoshop and everything. That's what they would say. So it kind of works, the Russian propaganda. Our military, having a strict order not to fire at residential areas under any circumstances, faced at the beginning of special military operation the unprecedented NATO tactics. The Ukrainian army did not protect its citizens, did not defend cities, taking positions at the areas close to the cities, but on the contrary, Ukraine equipped combat positions inside residential neighborhoods and did not allow local residents to leave them. That is, they used their own citizens as hostages, as a human shield. Such fanatical tactics have never been used before on their territory by any army of the world in history. You are already adults, dear high school students, draw your own conclusions from the new military tactics of Ukraine. Things that are really important for describing the causes of the war against Ukraine are indicated only in one sentence: the protection of Donbass and the proactive provision of Russia's security. For some reason, there is neither the so-called denazification or demilitarization. Those were the goals of the special military operation Putin claimed himself at the very start of the war. They wrote it so briefly on purpose. For example, in another year, the situation in the battlefront is going to be different, and Russia would not denazify or demilitarize Ukraine as Putin was stating at the start of the war. And when new propagandist manual would be sent to them, they would not need to rewrite the textbook, the history book, because it's written really shortly, and if there is nothing to state, there is nothing to be wrong about, right? The rest of the chapters are just literally pure propaganda, and we all know it too well to repeat it. So instead of just a textbook, it just appeared to be a printed Telegram screenshots, literally, of some Z authors. And to be honest, authors of that textbook do not even try to hide it. They tell you everything on Russian TV has been telling for the last 2 years. Ukraine is full of Nazis, the Banderites, they've been bombing Donbass for 8 years, and basically they're gonna tell you everything that Russian TV has been trying to say you. And of course, they're gonna say that, okay, West, they offended us, we blame West on everything, and they deceived our mother Russia. But there are some moments that cause nothing but laughter. The unprecedented and the unthinkable has happened. The West has stolen all the assets of the Russian state stored in their banks, totaling more than 300 billions of dollars. All these so-called sanctions, it is important to understand, are absolutely illegal. If you have thought that the fragment above is just one-time whining, apparently it's not. The whole book is just an endless whining about how great Russia was always bullied by spiteful US and Europe. And all this whining in this textbook is used so in the end, it would lead up to justification of the so-called special military operation of Russia against Ukraine. So the 448 pages of the textbook has over 400 mentions of the US and over 204 mentions of the word vast or different synonyms. And of course, the United States and Europe played a huge role in the history of Russia and the history of USSR during the Cold War. But in every single of these mentions, the authors, they just tried to show US and Europe as a cartoon villain. For example, instead of showing Cold War as a complex confrontation between two superpowers with oppressive ideologies, authors write that the USA started Cold War all by themselves. USA blackmailed the USSR with nuclear bombs, prepared plans for its nuclear bombing, put Europe into complete economic and political dependence, and wanted to preserve colonial empires, while the USSR only wanted to protect itself and liberate people of the world and create a belt of free friendly countries in Eastern Europe. The responsibility of Washington and its allies for the beginning of the confrontation is obvious. This is what's written, and then there is a question for students to answer. Was the USSR interested in an arms race and a new war? And of course, students are expected to answer how the US is bad, otherwise they would receive a bad grade from a teacher. Almost each chapter is somehow like an indirect argument with some imaginary Americans. And whatever happens, America is always to blame. For example, the chapter about the fall of the USSR contains fragments from the diary of George H.W. Bush about the meeting of the US National Security Council on the events in the USSR September 5th, 1991. Cheney argued if it's a voluntarily association, it will work. If democracy fails, it will be better for us if they are smaller. It is in our interest to peacefully split the Soviet Union, corrected Baker, who is the US Secretary of the State. Thus, they are trying to suggest to the reader that the United States indirectly participated in the collapse of the USSR. After 70 pages about how Russia is great under Putin and how much they achieved, they get back to their old ways and trying to tell that the US always is trying to somehow trick Russia, somehow to rip off Russia. And they did it again and again. Here you are. However, as Russia became stronger in 2000s, our desire for equal partnership was met with increasing opposition from the United States. The idea fix of the West was the destabilization of the situation inside of Russia. First, along the perimeter of its borders. For this reason, outright Russophobia was sponsored in the former republics of the USSR. Furthermore, according to the plan, Russia will be drawn into a series of conflicts and color revolutions. The imbalance of its economy and the charge of power to a controlled one. The ultimate goal is not particularly hidden at the same time. This is the dismemberment of Russia and control over its resources. According to the book, the West has always controlled dissidents inside of the USSR, and they kind of draw a line between dissidents in the USSR who were controlled by the West and so-called foreign agents who are basically repressed by the Russian government today. By the way, they try to make the difference be it applies not only to the society, but also to authority. The course book adores the Brezhnev era, the era of stagnation, the era of systematic crisis. So basically, some people call it the era of stability, but I remember even in my history books when I was in high school, my teacher was calling this period of time the period of stagnation. Khrushchev is also the bad apple. As it says in the book, he absolutely illegally transferred Crimea to Ukraine after all and started de-Stalinization, which shocked the populace. By the way, some certain narratives in this textbook are extremely misleading. So the most narrative of this whole leitmotif of this whole history book is the US is a slandering country that attempting to balkanize everyone in Russia, still staying strong defending its independence. But all of a sudden, whenever the situation warrants it, we can refer to those good old Americans as an ethical point to reference. And this is really weird. They are saying, yes, you are a villain, but if you did something, we can also do that. Because I guess they actually just envy the US. They do not even think the US is bad. They just envy the power of the US. And that's the only reason they are saying, the US is, we are fighting NATO, we are fighting US in Ukraine. Because they cannot just accept the fact and tell to the people that a 149 million country, with a population of 149 millions, are losing to how much time? 3 times less smaller Ukraine. They cannot accept that fact. That's why they are saying that it's all the US. We are fighting the great evil, the US. But they envy the US at the same time. That's why they always refer to the US as a ethical standpoint. Putin's system is seeking for crutches in the past. Following 4 revolutions in 20th century, Russian authorities has not the flimsiest idea about what crutches they should use right now. The ideologies are switching back and forth from the fascist philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who was praising Hitler, to the leader of the Communist Party in the 70s, Brezhnev. And this whole results in a bizarre idea of historical succession. This book is very depressing to read in my opinion, because it's not about patriotism, it's not about being loyal to one country. It's about how everything is bad and how we blame everyone for the problem of ours. It was me, Zach the Russian. If you want to support my channel, there is a Patreon link and PayPal link in the description below. I really appreciate that. As usual, I wish Ukraine will restore its territories. Do not forget to support Ukraine, and I hope that Putin's regime is going to be over sometime soon. It was me, Zach. See you in the next videos.